Ethan stepped off the small transport ship and onto the cracked landing platform of Keeler 9, a quiet alien colony floating at the edge of known space. The engines behind him powered down, and within seconds, the ship lifted away, leaving him alone in a place that felt forgotten by the galaxy. The air was thin but breathable, carrying a faint metallic smell mixed with dust. Tall, unfamiliar structures rose in the distance, worn by time and neglect. This world was not dead, but it was close to it. Ethan adjusted his worn jacket and took a slow breath. He had come here for one simple reason: work. Nothing more. No heroics, no trouble. Just enough to survive another day. As he walked toward the settlement, Ethan felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes on him. Aliens of different shapes and colors moved through the narrow paths, their conversations falling silent as they noticed him. Humans were rare this far from the core systems, and when they did appear, it was usually as soldiers, traders, or problems. Ethan was none of those things, but he knew how he looked to them: tall, scarred, and clearly out of place. He kept his hands visible and his movements calm, sending a silent message that he meant no harm. Still, doors closed softly as he passed, and children were pulled behind protective adults. This was not fear born of hatred, but of memory. The colony itself felt tired. Power lines hummed weakly overhead, and automated lights flickered even though it was still daytime. Market stalls stood half empty, their owners watching Ethan more closely than their goods. This place had seen better days. War had not reached Keeler 9 directly, but it had left scars all the same: lost trade routes, missing workers, and too many graves. Ethan understood that kind of quiet suffering. He had lived it for years, moving from world to world, always arriving too late and leaving too early. He stopped near the center of the settlement, scanning the area for any sign of opportunity. A job board hung on a metal wall, its surface scratched and outdated. Most listings were old, already taken or no longer relevant. Ethan sighed. He had hoped this place might be different. Still, he refused to give up. Humans survived by adapting, and he had learned that lesson the hard way. If work did not come to him, he would find it himself. That was when he felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, but this time it was different. Focused. Intent. Ethan slowly turned his head and saw her standing near a narrow side street. She was an alien female, tall and slender, with deep blue skin marked by faint silver lines that glowed softly in the light. Her clothing was simple and dark, practical rather than decorative. Behind her, partially hidden in the shadows of a doorway, were two small figures. Children. Their large eyes were fixed on Ethan with a mix of fear and curiosity. The widow did not move when their eyes met. She did not run or pull the children away like the others had. Instead, she studied him in silence, as if weighing something important. Ethan felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. He had seen that look before, not just caution, but loss. The kind that never truly healed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the settlement faded into the background, and the world seemed to narrow to that single, quiet connection. Ethan looked away first, not wanting to frighten her or the children. He reminded himself why he was here. Work. Survival. Nothing else. Yet as he continued walking, he could not shake the feeling that this moment mattered more than he understood. He moved past the market and toward the residential sector, asking a few careful questions along the way. Most aliens avoided answering, but one elderly shopkeeper finally pointed him toward a cluster of modest homes and mentioned a name in a low voice: the widow who lived there, alone since the war. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the colony, Ethan found himself standing outside a simple dwelling made of reinforced stone and alloy. It was quiet, almost too quiet. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the door. He had approached danger before without fear, but this felt different. This was not a battlefield or a contract. This was a choice. Somewhere inside, a voice told him to walk away, to keep moving as he always had. But another voice, older and heavier, urged him forward. Ethan took a steady breath and knocked. Behind the door, movement stirred. On this silent world, a stranger had arrived seeking work, but fate was already preparing an offer far beyond anything he had imagined. Ethan stood outside the small alien home as the door slowly opened and the widow appeared before him, her posture calm but guarded. Her eyes studied him with a depth that made him feel transparent. She did not ask his name, and she did not invite him in, yet she stepped aside enough to allow him to speak. Ethan explained in a quiet, steady voice that he was looking for work, any kind of work that required honest effort and little trouble. He said he could repair, build, protect, teach, or simply help. However, she listened without reacting. Her children watched from behind her legs, their small hands gripping the fabric of her clothing. The air between them felt heavy with unspoken history and pain. The widow finally gestured for Ethan to enter, and he followed carefully into the modest home. Inside, the space was clean but worn, signs of survival rather than comfort lined the walls. Simple tools, small beds, and faded symbols of family long gone. She offered him a seat and remained standing as if unsure whether to trust him fully. Ethan noticed the absence of another adult presence, and understood without being told this home had lost its protector long ago. The widow asked him about Earth, about humans, about why he had traveled so far alone. Ethan answered honestly, saying that humans often wandered when they had nothing left behind, and sometimes wandering was the only way to keep moving forward. Her eyes softened slightly at his words, but her voice remained firm as she explained that many had come to this world seeking profit or control, and none had stayed for the right reasons. Ethan told her he was not seeking profit, only survival, and a place where his hands could be useful. Silence followed, deep and thoughtful. Then the widow surprised him by asking what humans believed about family. Ethan hesitated before answering, saying that family was not always blood, but it was always a choice, and once chosen it meant protection, sacrifice, and staying even when it was difficult. The children leaned closer, listening though they pretended not to. She then revealed her truth, that her mate had died defending the colony, and since then fear had followed her home every night. Her children were growing without guidance, without safety, and without a future. She said workers came and left, soldiers frightened her, traitors lied to her, but humans were different, feared, respected, and unpredictable. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle heavily upon him. Then she spoke the sentence that changed everything. She said she did not need a worker, she needed a father. The words struck Ethan harder than any weapon he had faced. His breath slowed, his thoughts scattered. He had prepared himself for rejection, danger, or even violence, but not this. He looked at the children who watched him with silent hope mixed with fear and curiosity. The widow explained that alien culture valued strength above all else, and humans represented a strength beyond physical power, adaptability, loyalty, and an instinct to protect the young. She said if he accepted, he would no longer be a visitor but bound to them, to the colony, and to consequences greater than survival. Ethan stood slowly, unsure if his legs would hold him. He walked to the doorway and looked out at the fading light of the settlement. He had spent his life avoiding attachments because attachments led to loss, yet everywhere he went loss followed anyway. He remembered worlds burning, contracts broken, and faces forgotten, and for the first time he wondered if survival without meaning was just another kind of death. He returned his gaze to the widow and spoke carefully, saying he had never been a father, and did not know if he was worthy. She replied that worth was proven by staying, not by perfection. The children stepped closer now, no longer hiding, and one reached out, touching his sleeve before pulling back quickly as if afraid to hope. Ethan felt something shift deep within him, a quiet resolve forming. He asked for time to think, and the widow nodded, granting him the night to decide. As he left the home, the settlement seemed less silent than before, and the stars above felt closer, watching, waiting, knowing that whatever choice the human made would echo far beyond that quiet world. Ethan did not sleep that night, and when the artificial dawn lights of the colony slowly brightened the sky, he was already awake, sitting alone near the edge of the settlement, watching the distant horizon. He replayed the widow's words again and again, not a worker but a father. The idea felt heavy and unreal, like a story meant for someone else, not a man who had spent years drifting from one star system to another, avoiding roots and responsibilities he told himself that he could leave easily. No contracts, no bonds, no one would stop him, yet the thought of walking away felt harder than any journey he had taken before. The colony was quiet at this hour, and the silence gave his memories room to breathe. He remembered his own childhood on Earth long before the wars, when his father used to tell him that strength meant staying when everything inside you wanted to run. Those words had followed Ethan across the stars even when he pretended to forget them. He stood and walked slowly back toward the widow's home, unsure of what he would say but certain that running again would only deepen the emptiness. he carried. When he arrived, the door opened before he knocked, as if she had been waiting. The widow looked tired but steady, and the children stood beside her, their eyes wide and uncertain. Ethan stepped inside, and the space felt different now, warmer, more alive, as if hope itself had entered before him. He spoke plainly, saying he could not promise perfection or safety from every danger, but he could promise one thing: he would stay. The widow searched his face, looking for doubt or deception, and found only quiet determination. She nodded once, accepting his words as binding truth. In that moment, Ethan felt the invisible weight of choice settle onto his shoulders, not as a burden but as purpose. The children moved closer, still cautious but curious, and one of them smiled, a small, hesitant expression that struck him deeper than any battlefield wound. The day passed quickly as Ethan learned the rhythms of their life. He repaired a broken power unit, reinforced the door frames, and adjusted the home's weak shielding systems using skills he had picked up across countless worlds. The children followed him everywhere, asking simple questions with complex meanings: why humans traveled, why he was alone, why he chose them. Ethan answered honestly in ways they could understand, saying that sometimes humans lost their way and sometimes they found it again in places they least expected. The widow watched quietly as he worked, her guarded expressions slowly softening as actions replaced promises. By evening, word had spread through the settlement that the human had not left. Neighbors observed from a distance, uncertain and confused by a choice that made no sense in their logic. Humans were tools of war, not caretakers, not builders of family. That night, as they shared a simple meal, Ethan noticed how the children sat closer to him than before, instinctively seeking safety. The widow finally spoke of the colony's fears, how nearby factions saw humans as weapons, and how his presence could attract attention or danger. Ethan listened carefully, understanding the risk he was bringing, but he also understood something more important: fear already lived here, and running from it had solved nothing. He said that humans had another strength, one often ignored: the ability to stand as a shield, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. The widow lowered her head in respect, a rare gesture among her kind, and in that moment she accepted him not just as a guardian but as family. Later that night, alarms echoed faintly in the distance, not an attack, but a warning system triggered by unknown movement beyond the colony's sensor range. Ethan rose immediately, his instincts sharp, his body ready. He moved to secure the home, positioning himself between the door and the children. Without thinking, the widow noticed this small act and understood its meaning completely. This was not performance or obligation, this was instinct. The children watched him with awe, and the colony unknowingly witnessed the first sign of something new: a human not standing at the front of an army, but at the door of a home, guarding a future not his own. As the alarms faded, the threat passed for now, but the message was clear: forces beyond the settlement had taken notice. Ethan stood down slowly, aware that his decision had already begun to reshape the path ahead. He looked at the family beside him, and realized that whatever came next, he would face it not as a wanderer but as a father. And on that quiet, alien world, humanity took its first step toward being known for something greater than fear and fire. The days that followed passed in a strange calm that felt both fragile and promising. Ethan settled into a routine that was unfamiliar yet deeply grounding. Each morning he rose before the colony stirred, checking the perimeter of the home, reinforcing weak points, and mapping safe paths for the children to move through the settlement. He taught them simple human habits like awareness, patience, and the meaning of standing your ground without aggression. The children listened closely, absorbing every word, not because he demanded respect but because he earned it through consistency. The widow observed these changes with quiet amazement as her home slowly transformed from a place of survival into one of stability, something she had not felt since before the war. As time passed, Ethan introduced stories from Earth, not of conquest or destruction but of resilience, of humans building communities after loss and choosing hope when logic said otherwise. The children asked why humans told stories, and Ethan explained that stories reminded them who they were when the world tried to turn them into something else. The widow began to share her own memories in return, speaking of her mate and the day the colony lost its protectors. Her voice never broke, but her eyes carried years of unspoken grief. Ethan did not interrupt or offer comfort through words. He simply listened, understanding that presence was often more powerful than speech. This quiet exchange built a bridge between two worlds without either side fully realizing it. Outside the home, the colony watched and whispered. Aliens passed by more slowly, pretending not to stare as the human repaired systems helped elders and guided children without expectation of payment. This behavior confused them. Humans were meant to be temporary forces, either allies or threats, not anchors within a community. Some elders debated whether his presence would invite danger, while others saw something rare, a stabilizing influence. That the colony desperately needed the widow was questioned more than once about her choice, and each time she answered simply saying strength was not always loud and the colony had lived with loud strength long enough. The children began to change in visible ways. They walked taller, spoke with confidence, and no longer hid when strangers passed. Ethan trained them not in combat but in courage, teaching them to observe, assess, and act with intention. He showed them that fear was not something to eliminate but something to understand and manage. This lesson spread quietly among other young ones who began to gather near the home seeking the same guidance. Ethan never turned them away, though he remained careful not to overstep, knowing that trust once broken could never fully return. The widow noticed that laughter had returned to the home, something she thought had been lost forever. One evening, as the artificial sky dimmed, a group of colony elders arrived unannounced, their expressions cautious but respectful. They questioned Ethan directly, asking why a human would choose responsibility over freedom. He answered without hesitation, saying that freedom without purpose felt empty and humans were at their best when protecting something fragile. The elders exchanged silent glances, clearly unsettled by an answer that did not fit their understanding of human behavior. Before leaving, they warned him that external sensors had detected increased activity in nearby space, unknown ships moving slowly, watching, waiting. Ethan thanked them for the warning and adjusted his plans, knowing that calm was often the space between storms. That night, as the children slept, the widow stood beside Ethan near the doorway, watching the distant lights of the colony. She admitted that she had feared regret, but instead felt something close to relief. She asked him if humans truly stayed once they chose a family. Ethan answered quietly that humans failed often, but when they stayed completely. Her gaze remained on the stars, but her posture softened, a silent acceptance of a future she had never allowed herself to imagine before. In the days that followed, Ethan prepared not for war but for endurance, strengthening shelters, organizing evacuation routes, and teaching others what he knew without commanding or controlling. His leadership emerged naturally through action rather than authority, and the colony began to shift around him. Fear did not disappear, but it was no longer paralyzing. It became focused, purposeful, ready, and unseen beyond the colony sensors. Unknown eyes continued to observe and measure, but on that quiet world, something powerful was taking root, a lesson the galaxy would soon learn, that human strength was not only found on battlefields, but in the quiet choice to protect, teach, and remain when leaving would have been easier. The warning signs became impossible to ignore as the colony sensors began to register consistent movement at the edge of their detection range. Small signals at first, then patterns that suggested intent rather than chance. Ethan studied the data with a calm focus he had learned through years of survival. The ships were not broadcasting and they were not attacking, yet that made them more dangerous. Predators rarely announced themselves. The colony elders gathered in uneasy circles, debating whether to send a distress call or prepare to abandon the settlement, but evacuation was not simple. Many were old, many were young, and resources were limited. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when they finally asked for his opinion, he spoke carefully, saying that fear made people rush, and rushing made mistakes. He advised preparation without panic and movement without noise. His confidence was not loud, but it carried weight. At home, the children sensed the shift immediately. They asked fewer playful questions and watched Ethan more closely as he checked equipment and adjusted defensive measures. The widow remained steady, but her eyes followed every movement, knowing what was coming even if she did not speak it aloud. Ethan sat with the children and explained in simple terms that sometimes danger came without warning and that being brave did not mean pretending it was not there. He taught them where to hide, how to move quietly, and how to trust signals rather than fear. The children listened and followed every instruction, not out of obedience but trust. The first visible sign came when a shadow passed across the upper atmosphere, blocking distant starlight. For a brief moment, alarms did not sound, but everyone felt it, a pressure like the world holding its breath. Communications arrays flickered and long-range scanners failed, then returned with partial data. Unknown vessels of unfamiliar design were entering high orbit, too far to engage, too close to ignore. The colony had no defenses capable of facing a coordinated assault, and everyone knew it. Panic threatened to spread, but Ethan moved through the settlement calmly, directing people to shelters, reinforcing weak structures, and organizing watch rotations without ever raising his voice. Others followed because he acted as if order already existed. That night, the widow approached Ethan as he secured the outer doors and asked him directly if he regretted staying. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the children sleeping peacefully, unaware of how close danger had come. He told her that regret was something humans carried only when they failed to choose, and he had already chosen. She nodded, accepting both the comfort and the fear in his words she admitted that the invaders were likely from a faction that believed humans were weapons to be controlled or eliminated. His presence here would be seen as a threat or an opportunity. Either option promised peace. Ethan understood that he was no longer just protecting a family but representing an idea, humanity, as guardians rather than conquerors. As hours passed, the unknown ships remained silent, and the tension stretched thin. Then a transmission cut through the colony network. Brief, distorted, and deliberate, it demanded the surrender of the human. The message claimed his presence violated interstellar balance and posed a risk to surrounding systems. The elders turned to Ethan expecting anger or defiance, but he surprised them by listening fully. Before responding, he told them that he would not run and he would not allow the colony to be punished for his choice. He offered himself as a shield, not as a sacrifice, but as a statement. The widow stood beside him without hesitation and declared that he was family and family was not surrendered. The words spread quickly, and the colony rallied around a truth they had not known they believed in. The invaders did not attack immediately. Instead, they tested the defenses, sending small drones and probes to scan weaknesses. Ethan anticipated this and led teams to disrupt signals and create false data, making the colony appear stronger and more organized than it truly was. This bought time, but time was a limited resource. As the hours dragged on, tension sharpened into resolve. The people understood that whatever came next would define them, either as survivors who fled or as a community that stood together. As the first hostile craft began descending through the atmosphere, casting long dark shapes across the land, Ethan positioned himself at the front, not with advanced weapons but with strategy and unyielding resolve. He knew they underestimated him, and that was their greatest mistake. The children watched from safety, gripping each other's hands, and for the first time the widow allowed herself to hope not for victory but for survival with dignity. On that quiet world, as the threat from the stars drew closer, humanity prepared to be tested not by firepower but by the strength of its choice to protect rather than destroy. The first strike did not come as fire from the sky but as silence so complete it felt unnatural. The invaders' ships hovered low, their hulls dark and unfamiliar, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Communication across the colony failed in waves, and the ground vibrated with a steady pulse that rattled structures and nerves alike. Ethan moved with purpose, guiding defenders into position, reinforcing calm through action rather than words. He knew panic would destroy them faster than any weapon. The widow remained with the children in the reinforced shelter, watching through monitoring feeds as shadows moved closer and closer to their home. Ethan stood at the outer perimeter, his body tense, but his mind clear. He was no longer acting as a soldier or a hired protector. He was standing where a father should stand, between danger and those who depended on him. The first attackers descended silently, landing just beyond visual range and advancing in disciplined formations, their movements precise and mechanical, clearly trained to overwhelm through fear and efficiency. Ethan recognized the pattern. They expected resistance to break quickly. They expected him to fight like a human warrior, aggressive, direct, predictable. Instead, he waited, using the terrain and timing every movement. The defenders followed his signals, launching controlled disruptions, targeting sensors and mobility rather than life. Confusion spread among the attackers as their advantage faltered. They had prepared for violence, not restraint, not a defense built around preservation rather than destruction. As the invaders pushed forward, one unit breached the outer barrier and approached the residential zone. Ethan engaged them directly, moving with speed and precision. Using cover and misdirection, he disabled weapons, redirected force, and forced retreats without unnecessary casualties. Every action was calculated not to dominate but to delay, buying precious time for evacuation and coordination. The children watched the feeds with wide eyes, seeing not chaos but control. The widow felt fear tighten her chest, yet pride rose alongside it. This human was not fighting to prove strength, he was fighting to protect futures. The invaders adapted quickly, shifting tactics, deploying heavier units and aerial drones. The sky darkened with movement, and the ground shook as structures were tested to their limits. Ethan repositioned, constantly anticipating threats and guiding defenders through narrow escape routes. He never lost sight of the shelter, never allowed the enemy to draw him away from what mattered most. When a breach finally reached the outer wall of the home, he stood alone at the entrance, bracing himself as the door shook under repeated impacts. Inside, the children clung to each other, and the widow pressed her hand against the wall, feeling every strike as if it landed in her own chest. The door failed, but Ethan did not move aside. He met the invader's head on his stance, unyielding, his presence a declaration that they would go no further. The attackers hesitated, momentarily confused by a single unarmored human refusing to retreat. That moment was enough. Ethan acted with explosive focus, using close quarters tactics to neutralize the threat, pushing the attackers back beyond the threshold. When reinforcements arrived, they found not a conquered home but a fortified stand that had broken the enemy's momentum. Across the colony, similar moments unfolded as defenders inspired by Ethan's example held their ground, not out of duty, but out of belief. The invaders began to falter, their calculations failing to account for a force that fought not for conquest but connection. They had underestimated the cost of facing a species willing to endure loss without surrender. The turning point came when the invader command issued a retreat order, recognizing that continuing the assault would only deepen resistance and broadcast a message they could not control. As the ships lifted from the atmosphere, leaving behind damaged drones and shattered expectations, a heavy silence fell over the colony. Then slowly relief replaced tension. Survivors emerged from shelters, embracing one another, tears and laughter mixing freely. Ethan lowered himself against the wall, finally allowing exhaustion to surface. The widow ran to him, pulling him into a fierce embrace, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had almost lost. The children surrounded him, holding tight, calling him by a word that carried more meaning than any title, father. When dawn lights returned, the colony gathered not to celebrate victory but to honor what had been defended, a way of life built on trust and shared responsibility. The elders spoke of change, of alliances, and of how the galaxy would hear this story not as a tale of human violence but of human resolve. Ethan stood quietly among them, knowing that his choice had reshaped more than one world. On that once silent planet, humanity had shown its truest strength not through fire or fear but through the simple, unbreakable act of standing firm for family. Morning settled over the colony with a softness that felt unfamiliar, as if the world itself was recovering from holding its breath for too long. The damage left by the invasion was visible, but it was not overwhelming. Structures stood scarred yet standing, and the people moved with purpose rather than panic. Ethan walked through the settlement, helping where he was needed, lifting debris, restoring power lines, and offering quiet reassurance. Without ceremony, the invaders were gone and the danger had passed, but the impact of what had happened lingered in every shared glance and measured step. This was not just recovery, it was reflection. The colony elders called a gathering near the central square, a place that had once felt empty now filled with voices and movement. They spoke openly about the attack, about how the colony had survived, and about the human who had chosen to stay when leaving would have been safer. Ethan listened from the edge, uncomfortable with the tension. He had never acted for recognition, yet he understood that symbols mattered. The elders declared that the colony would no longer hide at the edge of known space. They would reach out, form alliances, and tell the truth of what had happened, not as a warning but as a lesson. Humanity was no longer a rumor of destruction but proof that strength could be defined by protection. As days turned into weeks, the changes deepened. Communication channels reopened and messages arrived from nearby systems. Curious, cautious, and questioning, many had heard fragments of the story, a human standing alone between invaders and children, refusing to abandon a world that was not his own. These stories traveled faster than any ship and carried more weight than official reports. The galaxy began to look at humanity differently, not as unpredictable weapons but as guardians capable of loyalty. Beyond contracts, the widow watched these developments with quiet pride, knowing that a choice made in desperation had reshaped not only her family but the perception of an entire species. At home, life took on a new rhythm. The children laughed more freely, their fear replaced by confidence and curiosity. Ethan taught them practical skills and shared stories not just of Earth but of the many worlds he had seen, emphasizing lessons of respect and responsibility. The widow and Ethan worked side by side, rebuilding not just walls but trust and understanding. Their bond grew naturally, rooted in shared experience rather than promises. Neither spoke of love directly, but it lived in small moments, in shared silence and coordinated movement, and in the certainty that neither would face the future alone. One evening, as the artificial sky glowed softly, the widow asked Ethan if he ever missed the freedom of wandering. He considered the question carefully before answering. He said that wandering had once felt like freedom because it required nothing but movement. Now he understood that real freedom came from choosing where to stand and accepting the responsibility that followed. She nodded, understanding that his journey had not ended but had finally found its direction. The colony established new defenses not built on fear but cooperation training programs, shared knowledge, and mutual aid. Ethan helped design systems that prioritized early warning and civilian safety, ensuring that the lessons learned would protect future generations. He refused formal titles or positions, choosing instead to remain what he had become: a father, a teacher, and a quiet example. Others began to follow his approach not because they were told to but because it worked. As time passed, the story of Keeler 9 became part of interstellar discourse, referenced in councils and studied in academies. Analysts struggled to categorize what had happened because it did not fit traditional models of conflict. It was not conquest or deterrence, it was commitment. Humanity had changed the equation by redefining what power looked like when exercised with restraint and purpose. On a quiet night, Ethan stood outside the home looking at the stars with the children beside him. The widow placed a hand on his shoulder, and he felt a sense of belonging that no ship or destination had ever given him. The galaxy remained vast and dangerous, but he no longer felt small within it. On that once silent world, humanity had found its voice not in dominance but in devotion, and the echo of that choice would shape the future in ways no one could yet fully imagine.